What is going on, everybody? It is your girl, Dayna Patreace, aka the Black Fairy, and this is my YouTube channel, Black Fairy Tings. I apologize for the little noise in the background. That is my puppy. She is biting on a bone, being a good girl in the corner, so I'm not going to make a big deal out of it. But today we are finally going to get into chapter 4 of When God Was a Woman, the Northern Invaders. Now, this is why I'm not letting that noise stop me from doing this, y'all. I know I've been saying I'm going to do it next weekend. I'm going to do it next weekend. And for those of you who may not know, I am actually just super busy. I'm in school. I'm taking high school courses again. I had to redo high school in order to go to the university program that I'd like to go into, which is midwifery. I do have a couple of videos of that journey on this channel. So if you're interested in knowing more about that, please subscribe, and also check out those videos to learn more about that. Today, again, we are going into chapter 4 for the book When God Was a Woman, which was written by Merlin Stone. It has opened up my eyes and also kind of verified a lot for me as an intuitive person, and just being born a beautiful melanated woman. I definitely don't feel like patriarchy is or was ever the standard. This is fairly new. We know patriarchy is only about 9,000 to 10,000 years old. And matriarchies were way more common than men would like us to believe, right? And this reinforces that. This book, I'm saying, reinforces that and shows us a different world where we were definitely doing much more than we are now. And why we are oppressed and how it benefits the other gender. Oh my gosh, she came closer with it, y'all. But we're going to get into this intro and we will be right back.
Yes. I fall in love with myself, and I want someone to share it with me. I want someone to share me with me.
Okay, so we are back. I'm going to go ahead and share the screen with the audio player, which will be playing chapter 4 of When God Was a Woman. I will be stopping to make commentary. Usually I read the chapter before. I didn't get through this whole chapter. I think I have 5 pages left. But again, I've been promising this video for weeks, and honestly, I want to be more consistent with this channel. And I think I've said this before, but I'm serious. I really want to. And it's all about making time, even when you don't have the time. At least that's what I'm stepping into. So over the next month of April, it's my birthday in April. And I'm just, with this new year of life that I'm coming up on, I definitely am going to be more focused than ever on my goals. And this channel is one of those things. I'm looking for a community of women that are like-minded and want to grow spiritually and just emotionally. And, I do believe in the law of attraction. I do believe that we can change our reality, but it's going to take like-minded individuals to come together to do that. We don't need many, but we do need, each other. Right? Especially if you want to see change. And I know I want to see change. So let's get into it. I'm going to share my screen. And just so you know, you will not be hearing the bone during the recording. As I'm sharing the screen and as I'm pressing play, I will mute myself, so you won't hear my puppy in the background, just only when I stop to make commentary. So yeah, let me share my screen. Let's add to the stage, and we will go to, oh, no. Hold on, y'all. I'm trying to find it. I liked, yeah, we could do it like this. I like this. I was gonna go for the other one, but this is cool too. Let's see. Let's press play and let's get into it. Now, this one is an hour and 29 minutes and 23 seconds. I'm going to speed it up a little bit. I think, did I do 1.2 last time? I think I did 1.5 as far as speed. And this is actually the last chapter that's this long, which I think will also make it easier because I definitely have to carve out the time, right? And I never feel like I have it. But this being the last chapter of this length, and they kind of go down from there, I think we're going to be good. And I'll be able to definitely carve out time to not only finish the chapter before I come on here to discuss it, but just to also get myself more consistent. It's going to be easier with shorter blocks of time. But yeah.
Why and when the more northern tribes came to choose a male deity is a moot question. In their earliest development, they left neither tablets nor temples. It is only upon their arrival in the goddess-worshipping community.
Sorry, let me pull it back to the beginning, or maybe it's, there we go, to 0. Let's go. 1.5 is kind of fast, right? Did you guys, the thing is, I'm pre-recording this, so you can let me know. I'm going to go to like 1.4. I know it's not that much different, but it seemed kind of quick. But yeah, sorry. Let's continue.
4. The Northern Invaders. Why and when the more northern tribes came to choose a male deity is a moot question. In their earliest development, they left neither tablets nor temples. It is only upon their arrival in the goddess-worshipping communities of the Near and Middle East, which by that time had developed into thriving urban centers, that they come to our attention. The lack of evidence for earlier cultural centers in their northern homelands of Russia and the Caucasus region, just previous to the invasions, suggests that up until their arrival in the Near and Middle East, they may still have been nomadic hunting and fishing groups, possibly shepherds just beginning to practice agriculture. These northern peoples are referred to in various contexts as Indo-Europeans, Indo-Iranians, Indo-Aryans, or simply Aryans. Their existence, once it surfaced in historical periods, portrays them as aggressive warriors, riding two abreast in horse-drawn war chariots. Their earlier, more speculative appearances in prehistoric times, as big sailors who navigated the rivers and coastlines of Europe and the Near East. Discussing.
Is it just me, or was that a little roundabout way to say that it's white people? I don't know. Maybe it's just me. I just was like, she's describing them, and I'm just like, just say white people. But okay.
Their origins, Hawks writes of the Mesolithic and Neolithic groups known as the battle axe cultures, telling us that on no subject have authorities differed so completely or with greater lack of objectivity than on the origins of these cultures. The reason for this partisanship lies in the one thing the authorities are agreed upon, that the battle axe cultures represent the roots of the Indo-European speaking peoples. What can be said with some certainty is that the battle axe people had a large ethnic, social, and cultural inheritance from the hunter-fishers of the forest cultures, such as the Maglemosian and Kunda. Though it may not always or everywhere have been so, this character came in time to be dominantly pastoral, patriarchal, warlike, and expansive. These Maglemosian and Kunda people of Mesolithic times, about 15,000 to 8,000 BC, were generally located in the forest and coastal areas of northern Europe, most especially in Denmark. Their sites were generally further north than those of the earlier Gravettian or Ignatian groups who left us the heritage of the Venus figures. The invasion by the northern peoples was not a single major event, but rather a series of migrations, which took place in waves over a period of at least 1,000 and possibly 3,000 years. The invasions of the historical period, which began at about 2400 BC, are attested by literature and surviving artifacts, and are agreed upon by most historians and archaeologists. Those of prehistoric times are speculative, based upon suggestive evidence and etymological connections. These earlier and less extensive invasions would take us back to 4000 to 3000 BC, thus taking place before the time of written records. They are not generally associated with the same invading tribes, yet on the basis of the evidence that does appear, I feel that they should be mentioned along with the more attested periods, so that the reader may draw her or his own conclusions. What is most significant is that in history,
So for me, when she gets into the invasion of the Northern people, like, it's not one singular major event, which is how I feel like a lot of men try to like condense themselves into history and how it happened. Like they just came in with all their aggression and all their brute force, talking about like, oh, we were kings and we conquered you and we conquered women with our brute force. We are physically stronger. I was just on a TikTok live the other day. I wasn't on it, but I was listening to it. And they were discussing this, and many of the men came forward, like act like, well, we have brute strength, therefore we are superior. And to know me, if you don't know, I do think women are the superior gender. And I've gone over that in other videos. Perhaps I'll link the specific video because I literally have a video, I believe it's entitled Women Are Superior, where I go through why I kind of hold that belief, right? So, but when she said that, like a lot of men will say, oh, we came in and we just took over. No, it happened in waves. It was a series of migrations. It wasn't just this singular event where men came in, decided they were the boss, decided they were stronger. No, they did not do that. These invasions and these implementations of these misogynistic ideas we have now, of these patriarchal ideals we have now, it happened over time, right? So that was something that stood out to me in regards to this book as well, and how it highlights the ushering in of patriarchy and the oppression of women and the goddess. For me, I find it very interesting because that's something that they actually always like to say. But I mean, most of those men definitely don't know what they're talking about. So let's get back into it.
historic times, the Northern Invaders viewed themselves as a superior people. This attitude seems to have been based primarily upon their ability to conquer the more culturally developed earlier settlers, the people of the goddess. The Indo-Europeans were in continual conflict, not only with the people whose lands they invaded, but between themselves as well. The pattern that surfaces in each area in which they make an appearance is that of a group of aggressive warriors, accompanied by a priestly caste of high standing, who initially invaded, conquered, and then ruled the indigenous population of each land they entered. The dates given for their original appearance in the Near East vary. Professor James suggests that the Indo-Europeans were established on the Iranian plateau by the 4th millennium. The curators of the Fitzwilliam Museum in Cambridge, England, date their entry into Anatolia at the late 4th millennium or early part of the 3rd. Professor Albright suggests their appearance in Anatolia at not later than the early 3rd millennium, while Professor Seton Lloyd writes, in about 2300 BC, a great wave of Indo-European peoples speaking a dialect known as Luvian seemed to have swept over Anatolia. Professor Gordon tells us that Indo-Europeans appear on the Near East scene shortly after 2000 BC. While their chief representatives are the Hittites, the Mitannian kings and gods often bear Indo-European names. The Iranian plateau was to become a great stamping ground of the Aryans, as we may call the segment of the Indo-Europeans to which the Iranians belong. Gordon elaborates further, explaining that the influx of the Indo-European immigrants into the Near East during the 2nd millennium BC revolutionized the art of war. The newcomers introduced the horse-drawn war chariot, which gave a swift striking power hitherto unknown in the Near East. The elite charioteer officers, who bear the Indo-European name of Marianu, soon became a new aristocracy throughout the entire area, including Egypt. From Anatolia and Iran, these tribes continued to push southward into Mesopotamia and Canaan, according to Professor Albright. There is both archaeological and documentary evidence pointing to a great migratory movement or movements from the northeast into Syria in the 18th century BC. As a result of this movement, Hurrian and Indo-Iranian tribes flooded the country. By the 15th century, we find most of eastern and northern Syria occupied predominantly by Hurrians and Indo-Iranians. Megiddo, Jerusalem, and Ascalon, all in Canaan, are ruled by princes with Anatolian or Indo-Iranian names. The cranial type at Megiddo, which was previously Mediterranean in character, now becomes brachycephalic alpine. As the invasions were sporadic, they are difficult to follow and would probably require a volume on each particular area over a long period of time to be thoroughly explained. But historical, mythological, and archaeological evidence suggests that it was these northern people who brought with them the concepts of light as good and dark as evil, very possibly the symbolism of their racial attitudes toward the darker people of the southern areas, and
So this part here, I'm going to pull it back just a little bit, but she's getting into, as the invasions were sporadic, they were difficult to follow and would probably require a volume on each particular area over a long period of time to be thoroughly explained. I'm going to pull but just back just a little bit to that part because I really want us to pay attention to right here. I actually highlighted a lot of it, but again, it goes into, the caste system and how it became. Before this was not a common thing, as people would like to believe, not in the same way. There was this ushering in of a male deity, and that male deity was ushered in by these Northern Invaders, right? Which is aligned with my own history, right? Like this is one of the things that made me turn away from religion myself. You know, I grew up in a very Christian home. I grew up Seventh-day Adventist. Okay, that's a very strict Christian religion, cult-like in a lot of ways. And with that being said, learning about Black history, learning about how Christianity was given to Black people as a way to further oppress them in the mind, not just the body, was one of the reasons why I recoil now at the thought of being a part of a religious group. And that's not to say you can't believe what you want to believe. I'm just explaining how this part is important to understand as well if you are deconstructing yourself from patriarchy and deconstructing yourself from even maybe Christianity and all, like, you know, patriarchal religions. This is something that I think is very important to hear and understand. This was built as kind of like a caste system, right? It was not like this before. We didn't always live in a world that had this representation. We're going to get into it though. I'm sorry. I didn't even mean to like talk about it this long, but this part was super important to me.
Near East. Than the early 3rd millennium. While Professor Seton Lloyd writes, in about 2300 BC, a great wave of Indo-European peoples speaking a dialect known as Luvian seemed to have swept over Anatolia. Professor Gordon tells us that Indo-Europeans appear on the Near East scene shortly after 2000 BC. While their chief representatives are the Hittites, the Mitannian kings and gods often bear Indo-European names. The Iranian plateau was to become a great stamping ground of the Aryans, as we may call the segment of the Indo-Europeans to which the Iranians belong. Gordon elaborates further, explaining that the influx of the Indo-European immigrants into the Near East during the 2nd millennium BC revolutionized the art of war. The newcomers introduced the horse-drawn war chariot, which gave a swift striking power hitherto unknown in the Near East. The elite charioteer officers, who bear the Indo-European name of Marianu, soon became a new aristocracy throughout the entire area, including Egypt. From Anatolia and Iran, these tribes continued to push southward into Mesopotamia and Canaan, according to Professor Albright. There is both archaeological and documentary evidence pointing to a great migratory movement or movements from the northeast into Syria in the 18th century BC. As a result of this movement, Hurrian and Indo-Iranian tribes flooded the country. By the 15th century, we find most of eastern and northern Syria occupied predominantly by Hurrians and Indo-Iranians. Megiddo, Jerusalem, and Ascalon, all in Canaan, are ruled.
Sorry, y'all, I went too far back, but I am going to let it continue.
Ruled by princes with Anatolian or Indo-Iranian names. The cranial type at Megiddo, which was previously Mediterranean in character, now becomes brachycephalic alpine. As the invasions were sporadic, they are difficult to follow and would probably require a volume on each particular area over a long period of time.
This is the part right here.
To be thoroughly explained. But historical, mythological, and archaeological evidence suggests that it was these northern people who brought with them the concepts of light as good and dark as evil, very possibly the symbolism of their racial attitudes toward the darker people of the southern areas, and of a supreme male deity. The emergence of the male deity in their subsequent literature, which repeatedly described and explained his supremacy, and the extremely high position of their priestly caste, may perhaps allow these invasions to be viewed as religious crusade wars, as much as territorial conquests. The arrival of the Indo-Aryan tribes, the presentation of their male deities as superior to the female deities of the indigenous populations of the lands they invaded, and the subsequent intricate interlacing of the two theological concepts are recorded mythologically in each culture. It is in these myths that we witness the attitudes that led to the suppression of goddess worship. As Sheila Collins writes, theology is ultimately political. The way human communities deify the transcendent and determine the categories of good and evil have more to do with the power dynamics of the social systems which create the theologies than with the spontaneous revelation of truth from another quarter. Judging from the production of religious mythology of the royal scribes and priests found in the archives of palaces of the Indo-European ruled nations of the historic periods, often in the language of the conquered populations, we may surmise that political aims, rather than religious fervor, may well have been the motivation. The prevalence of myths that explain the creation of the universe by the male deity, or the institution of kingship, when none had existed previously, strongly hints at the possibility that many of these myths were written by priests of the invading tribes to justify the supremacy of the new male deities and to justify the installation of a king as the result of the relationship of that king to the male deity. The Indo
Another good thing to research, another good book, and even I want to go over it, it would be that kind of breaks down further how this male deity came to be, how the idea of it came to be. There was a whole council that came together specifically to put together the hierarchy religion of Christianity. But they've done this with Allah, they've done this with other male deities to uphold these patriarchal ideas that we have and to remove ourselves from what we truly know. One thing I know for sure is people don't oppress other people that are generally weaker than them. To me, it just gives another notch in that belt that says that women are in fact superior, is the fact that men feel like they have to oppress us in order to be able to be in charge and be able to lead, right? They can't do that if we are given the equal opportunities as them. So they need to keep us under them in order to be able to sustain sustain the society that they have created and benefit from, right? But let's continue.
Indo-European male deity, unlike the son and or lover of the goddess religion, was most often portrayed as a storm god, high on a mountain, blazing with the light of fire or lightning. This recurrent symbolism suggests that these northern people may once have worshipped volcanoes as manifestations of their god, a factor I will discuss more thoroughly in Chapter 5. In some areas, this god was annexed to the goddess as a husband, such as the storm god Taru and the sun goddess of Arena, or Zeus and Hera. In some legends, he emerged as a rebellious young man who heroically destroyed the older female deity, at times upon the previously assured promise of supremacy in the divine hierarchy. In many of these myths, the female deity is symbolized as a serpent or dragon, most often associated with darkness and evil. At times, the gender of the dragon seems to be neuter, or even a male, closely associated with his mother or wife, who is the goddess. But the plot and the underlying symbolic theme of the story is so similar in each myth that, judging from the stories that do use the name of the female deity, we may surmise that the allegorical identity of the dragon or serpent is that of the goddess religion. The goddess, the original supreme deity of the people, conquered and ruled by the invading Indo-Europeans, was not ignored, but was symbolically included in such a manner that these supposedly religious myths allow us to trace her eventual deposition. The male deity is invariably the powerful champion of light. With slight variations, we find the myth in Hittite Anatolia in the battle between the storm god and the dragon Illuyankas, in India between Indra, lord of the mountains, and the goddess Danu and her son, Vritra, in northern Canaan between Baal, who plays a dual role as the storm god of Mount Saphon, as well as the brother consort of the goddess Anath, and the serpent Lotan, or Lawton. In the Canaanite language, Lat means goddess. In Babylon, probably in the Indo-European period of Kassite control, between Marduk and the goddess Tiamat. In Indo-European, Mitannian-controlled Assyria, Ashur simply assumes the deeds of Marduk. In Indo-European Greece, between Zeus and the serpent Typhon, son of the goddess Gaia. Between Apollo and the serpent Python, also recorded as the son of Gaia. And between Hercules and the serpent Ladon, who guards the sacred fruit tree of the goddess Hera, said to be given to her by Gaia at the time of her marriage to Zeus. The myth appears in the ancient Hebrew writings, whose connections to the Indo-Europeans shall also be thoroughly discussed in Chapter 5. As the conquest by the Hebrew god Yahweh, Jehovah, of the serpent Leviathan, another Canaanite name for Lotan. It may even survive in the legends of St. George and the Dragon and St. Patrick and the Snakes. The female religion, especially after the earlier invasions, appears to have assimilated the male deities into the older worship and the goddess survived as the popular religion of the people for thousands of years after the initial invasions. By the time of Marduk and Ashur of the 16th century BC, her position had been greatly lowered in Mesopotamia. But it was upon the last assaults by the Hebrews and eventually by the Christians of the first centuries after Christ that the religion was finally suppressed and nearly forgotten. It is in these accounts of the Indo-European people that we may find the origins of many of the ideas of the early Hebrews. The concept of the god on the mountaintop, blazing with light, the duality between light and dark symbolized as good and evil, the myth of the male deity's defeat of the serpent, as well as the leadership of a supreme ruling class, each so prevalent in Indo-European religion and society, are to be found in Hebrew religious and political concepts as well. This influence or possible connection with the Indo-European peoples may provide the explanation for the extreme patriarchal attitudes of the Hebrews, which will be thoroughly discussed in Chapter 5. By first becoming aware of the Indo-European political patterns and religious imagery, Hebrew attitudes and ideas that were later adopted into Christianity may be better understood. India. Origin.
Okay, so I'm glad that in the next chapter we'll be kind of deep diving more into that. I'm excited about that actually, because I was gonna make a comment like right here, but again, she says it right. Hebrew attitudes and ideas that were later adopted into Christianity may be better understood. I'm really intrigued as to what that looks like. Now, this next section she's going into is about India and the origin of castes. Like, this is how and where they got the whole setup for not only keeping us separated by gender, but by our skin tone, right? Because at the end of the day, there really is only one human race, right? There's no actual race. We have different phenotypes and genotypes, but race is literally not a real thing. That being said, let's get into like what she's found. Because I do have some highlighted here, but I don't really remember. It's so funny, but let's get into it.
Of the castes. In India, there is some of the clearest evidence of the Indo-Aryan invasions and the conquest of the original goddess-worshipping people. The language of the Indo-Aryans of India was what we today refer to as Sanskrit. Upon their arrival, the northern peoples did not yet possess a method of writing. They adopted two alphabets, possibly from the Akkadians. With these scripts, they wrote their hymns and other literature. Thus, the most comprehensive records of the Indo-Aryans in India were in the books known as the Vedas, written sometime between 1500 and 1200 BC in the Indo-European Sanskrit language, using the borrowed scripts. In 1963, Professor E.O. James wrote, "It appears that the sky gods in the ancient Vedic pantheon were already established among the Aryan tribes when they began their migrations in the 2nd millennium BC. On their arrival in India, they found, contrary to belief prior to the archaeological excavations in and around the Indus Valley since 1922, not a primitive aboriginal population, but a highly developed urban civilization, superior to their own relatively simple way of life, as depicted in the Rig Veda." Writing in 1965, Giuseppe Sormani also tells us that the Aryans came into contact with highly civilized and already ancient forms of settled society, in comparison with which they were mere barbarians. He also explains that they had long since abandoned matriarchy and had a patriarchal family system, as well as a patriarchal form of government. According to the hymns in the Indo-Aryan Rig Veda, in the very beginning of time, there was only Asura, living power. The Asura then broke down into two cosmic groups. One was the enemies of the Aryans, known as the Danavas, or Dityas, whose mother was the goddess Danu, or Diti. The other group, clearly the heroes of the Aryans, were known to them as the Adityas. This title betrays the fact that this mythical structure was created in reaction to the presence of the worshippers of Diti, since Aditya literally means not Dityas, not people of Diti. This strongly suggests that these mythical hymns were not only written down after the Aryans came into contact with the goddess people, but were conceived and composed after that time as well. One of the major Indo-Aryan gods was known as Indra, lord of the mountains, he who overthrows cities. Upon obtaining the promise of supremacy, if he succeeded in killing Danu and her son Vritra, he does accomplish the act, thus achieving kingship among the Adityas. In a hymn to Indra in the Rig Veda, which describes the event, Danu and her son are first described as serpent demons. Later, as they lie dead, they are symbolized as cow and calf. Both images of cow and serpent are associated with the worship of the goddess, as it was known in the Near and Middle East. After the murders, the cosmic waters flowed and were pregnant. They, in turn, gave birth to the sun. This concept of the sun god emerging from the primeval waters appears in other Indo-European myths and also occurs in connection with two of the prehistoric invasions. The Indo-Aryan attitude toward women is made clear in two sentences attributed to Indra in the Rig Veda. "The mind of woman brooks not discipline, her intellect has little weight. We may find this statement rather ironic in light of the level of the culture of the patriarchal, male-worshipping Indo-Aryans compared with that of the more female-oriented, goddess-worshipping people they forcibly subdued.
I was going to touch on that because I thought the Indo-Aryan attitudes, like I felt the same exact way, like reading it. And their attitude of like really feeling insecure because of how advanced these other societies were. There's this society that I literally, I saw on YouTube, and I remember, I can't remember right now the name off the top of the head, but I saved it because I wanted to definitely do a video about it. And I wanted to do a little bit more research, but it told a story of a city like that, that I think was in Ethiopia. And the city was beautiful. It had its sewer system. It had like this whole electricity system that gave them light at night. So much like the lights that we have when the sun goes down, they had similar. And how the Indo-Aryans, the Northern Europeans came down and destroyed it all just out of jealousy. Again, because they had not discovered yet how to do those things. And they had this ideal of light over darkness, and how light is better than dark, and how that translated into the racist caste system that we have now. But let's get back into it.
The Rig Veda also refers to an ancestral father god known both as Prajapati and Deus Pitar. He appears as an almost abstract idea in the Rig Veda. Yet Deus Pitar is known in later Brahmanic writings as supreme father of all. Evidence of ancestor worship of the father occurs in several hymns of the Rig Veda. The Indo-Aryans daily recited the Pratyajna, the worship of the ancestral fathers. In this ritual, the father of the family acted as high priest, later passing these rites on to his eldest son. In Sanskrit, Pitar means father, but Pati has various meanings. The connections assure us of the position of men in these northern tribes. Pati has the alternative translations of lord, ruler, master, owner, and husband. The spread of the Indo-Aryan culture brought with it the origins of the Hindu religion and the concept of light-colored skin being perceived as better than darker skins. The Brahmins, the priests of the lighter Indo-Aryans, were considered to be the epitome of the racial hierarchy. Sormani reports that much study has been given to the real origin of the castes, and the most dependable theories trace these back to the invasions of ancient times. The white-skinned Aryans did not wish to mingle with the dark-skinned Dravidians, who were the original inhabitants. The Sanskrit word for caste, varna, means color. The first measures towards dividing the populations into castes were laws that forbade mixed marriages between Aryans and Dravidians. In the later Bhagavad Gita, the Aryan hero Arjuna speaks of his fear of undermining the very structure of society. His concern is that he might produce lawlessness, which is then described as meaning the corruption of women, which in turn would lead to caste mixture. A figure who appears in the Indo-Aryan mythology of 400 BC, though he may have been known in legend before that time, is Rama, who symbolizes the Brahmanic tradition. Norman Brown, professor of Sanskrit at the University of Pennsylvania, describes him this way. Rama is the mythic agent for spreading Aryan, that is, Brahmanic or Sanskrit culture, to the then un-Aryanized south of India, where even now culture is primarily a possession of the Brahmins, overlying a substratum which is chiefly Dravidian. Rama's conquest is by force of arms. He is thus represented as having brought culture and light to the Aborigines, who when intransigent are called demons, and when willing converts, monkeys and bears. Thus it may have been that the patriarchal invaders, who saw women as inferior, are responsible for the origins of racist attitudes as well.
And we still see that today, guys, like monkeys, just referring to people of darker skin, melanated people as monkeys. And like to this day, 2025, this is something that they still describe us as, and they're told about, and as this evil thing just because our skin is different. And because we were who we were and we had what we had, instead of wanting to learn from, these invaders decided to take from. And instead of joining, they just really wanted to conquer, and thus proving themselves to be superior. Again, there's that superiorness, like, no, men are better, we're better, men are better, yes, but white men are better overall. Like this is not new, and they've found ways to just continuously brainwash us, so much to the point that I feel like the only reason that they gave us rights at all was because they truly believed that they had brainwashed us enough, traumatized us enough, us as in women, to be able to get to a place where they thought, no, they won't really kind of step outside those boundaries. And now with them trying to scale back because they regret giving us freedoms in the first place, and they see themselves losing grasp over what they've worked so hard to obtain over time, they're trying to scale back. But we all know it's too late. But yeah, let's continue.
Light to the Aryans may have been the blinding light of volcanic eruptions, later symbolized by the light of their ever-present fire sacrifices, the light of the astral bodies, especially the sun, the lightning bolts of their storm god, perhaps the lightness of their own skin color, as compared with the Mediterranean people, and the realm of eternal light, where the spirits of the Aryan dead were supposed to reside. The gracious fathers dwell in glowing light, light primeval. Brahma, whose name eventually came to be that of the supreme god, is described as he whose form is light. Dev, the Sanskrit word for god, literally means shining or bright. Mithra, still another god who appears in the Rig Veda, later to emerge in a more important role in the Iranian Avesta, is continually associated with light, while Varuna, which seems to be another name of Deus Pitar, has the task of performing daily sacrifices to bring the shining sun out of the deep dark space under the earth. Archaeological evidence, especially the work of Sir John Marshall, reveals that before the Aryan invasions, the indigenous population of India revered the goddess. The earliest cultures of the Indus Valley seem to have been in contact with Sumer and Elam at about 3000 BC. Religious attitudes and beliefs are often firmly entrenched in family and social custom. If the major part of the population once held the goddess as sacred, it does not seem too surprising to find that these beliefs were revived at times when it was safe to do so openly, though we may find the time span rather astonishing. In later periods of Indian history, as in many other areas where the worship of the male deity was superimposed upon the female religion, many people, perhaps those who remained in more isolated areas, still retained the worship of the goddess. As late as AD 600, the worship of the female divinity once again surfaced in India. She appeared in the Puranas and Tantras under many names, but the name Devi, simply meaning goddess, combined them all. Yet the name Devi was from the Sanskrit Dev. Her name, Danu or Diti, had been forgotten. Professor Brown explains that the reason why we do not hear of her sooner, doubtless, is that the Great Mother is not Aryan in origin, and was late in gaining Brahmanic recognition. She is quite different from any of the female deities in the Rig Veda. The Great Mother Goddess is widely worshipped in India today in non-Aryan circles. In South India, every village has its collection of ammas, or mothers, and their worship is the chief religious exercise of the village. The priests of these deities, they have priestesses as well, are not Brahmins, but are members of lower castes, thus indicating the pre-Aryan or at least non-Aryan worship of these goddesses. Brown tells us that the goddess was eventually incorporated into Brahmanic literature, but points out that the Great Mother conception still has a dubious position in Brahmanic circles. Iran, the seed of the Aryan lands. Indo-Aryan beliefs are also found in the writings of Iran, though at a much later period. The oldest written material from Iran, unfortunately, dates back only as far as 600 BC to the Zend Avesta of Zarathustra. But this mythological material is enlightening, for as James explains, Indians and Iranians alike were, as we have seen, Aryans, derived from the same Indo-European ethnological stock, established on the Iranian plateau since the 4th millennium BC, and apparently spoke a Vedic Sanskrit dialect. Professor M.J. Dresden also tells us that a substantial body of linguistic, religious, and social evidence warrants the assumption that at one time, the bearers of the two cultures, which find their expression in the Indian Rig Veda on the one hand, and in parts of the Iranian Avesta on the other, formed a unity. Though there certainly must have been considerable change from the time of the Rig Veda until the writing of the Avesta, we again find the concept of a great father who represents light, now known as Ahura Mazda. He is generally referred to as the Lord of Light, and his abode is on a mountaintop, glowing in golden light. This dwelling is said to be on Mount Hara, supposedly the first mountain ever created. In the language of the Indo-Iranians, Hara actually meant mountain. The duality of light and dark as good and evil is everywhere evident in Iranian religious thought. Ahura Mazda is on high in goodness, while a devil-like figure called Ahriman is deep down in darkness. In one account, Ahriman dared to come up to the border between them, there to be blinded by the light of Ahura. Seeing valor and supremacy superior to his own, he fled back to the darkness. In the Iranian texts of AD 200, known as Manchian, once again we find good and evil equated with light and dark. In these statements, we are told that the problems of humanity are caused by the mixture of the two. Mithra, who appears in the Rig Veda, emerges more significantly in Iranian thought. Now it is Mithra, who defeats the demons of darkness. Most interesting is the Iranian figure known as Gayo Moreta, the first man created. Gayo Moreta may have once been much the same figure in Iran as Indra was in India. Gayi or Gavi in Sanskrit means cow. Maritu in Sanskrit means death or murder, surviving in the Indo-European German language as mord, meaning murder, and in the Indo-European English language as the word murder itself. Thus, Gaia Moreta appears to be named cow murderer, just as Danu was symbolized as the cow goddess, whose worship is best known from Egypt, and Indra, her murderer. So Gaia Moreta may once have held this position in Iran. In the Pahlavi books of about 400 BC, it was written, "From Gaia Moreta, Ahura fashioned the family of the Aryan lands, the seed of the Aryan lands." A later addition to Iranian mythology as we know it again appears to be a revival of the goddess religion. According to Iranian texts of the 4th century AD, the goddess Anahita was in charge of the universe. Curiously enough, they tell us that Ahura Mazda has given her the task of watching over all creation. The Horians, a ruling caste of Indo-Aryans, an earlier group of people who further...
I just did want to say, I don't have much to say as she goes through the periods. I think that she's being very thorough. So I am going to be on the fairly quiet end for a little bit because she's being quite thorough and going through everything from their beliefs, where they came from, to the gods and goddesses and their stories and backgrounds. There's not much that I have to add. So it will be fairly, mostly not as much commentary as we continue into like a few, at least the next few pages.
To explain the identity and cultural patterns of the invading northerners were known as the Horians. The greater percentage of Horian people were not Indo-European. At least they did not use an Indo-European language. But they were from an area either north of Anatolia or northern Iran, and were a brachycephalic alpine group, as were the Indo-Europeans. It was perhaps in that area that they too were first conquered and then ruled by Indo-Europeans. These people, says Professor Saggs, long known in the Old Testament as the Horites or Horims, spoke a language having no recognized affinities, except in the later Urartian. They must have reached the mountains north of Assyria, presumably from the Caucasus region, in the second half of the 3rd millennium BC. By 2400 BC, there was an isolated Horian settlement at Urkish, in the Habor Valley, west of Assyria. At the same time, at Nuzi and Telbrak, later to become important centers of the Horian kingdom, Horian names began to appear. Some were found as far south as Babylon, while by 2300 BC, Horian names appeared in the Sumerian city of Nippur, some 40 miles from Erech. Archaeologist O.R. Gurney wrote The Hittites in 1952. In this book, he suggested that the original homeland of the Horians was in northern Iran. He records that the Horian people are known to have spread gradually southward and westward from their home in the mountainous regions south of the Caspian Sea, from about 2300 BC onwards, and to have become organized during the 2nd millennium into several powerful kingdoms, situated near the upper waters of the Euphrates and the Habor. Although most of the Horian people were not Indo-European, our interest in the Horians, or Horites, is based on the evidence that their kings and leaders were. Saggs explains that the kings of Mitanni bore not Horian, but Indo-European names, whilst the old Indian gods, Mitra, Varuna, and Indra, were worshipped. All this points to the presence of an Aryan warrior caste ruling over a largely non-Aryan population. Gurney agrees, stating that Mitanni was ruled by a dynasty of kings whose names have an Aryan etymology, and Indian deities such as Indra and Varuna figure prominently in its pantheon. It is thus clear in Mitanni, a population of Horians was dominated by a ruling caste of Indo-Aryans. The legend of Indra may have been known, since he is mentioned in the Horian tablets, but as yet no actual Horian accounts of the legend have been found. One Horian myth known through Hittite copies, though not a typical dragon story, revolves around the efforts to destroy Teshub, consort of the important Anatolian goddess Hepat, whom Hittite queen Pudu-Hepa considered to be much the same deity as the sun goddess of Arena. The major protagonist is the god known as Kumarbi, whose religious center is listed as the early Horian settlement of Urkish. In this myth, he is called Father of all gods. His Aryan connections are visible in his name. Rajkumar in Sanskrit means prince. Kumarbi gives birth to a child made of stone named Ulikumi, which is the name of a mountain in the Kizilwatna territory of Cilicia in south-central Anatolia, possibly the double-peaked volcanic mountain known today as Hasan Dagh. It is Ilukumi's job to destroy Teshub. The text is quite long and involved and broken at many vital sections, but the major point is that Ulikumi is told to suppress the city of Kumia, to hit Teshub, pound him like chaff, and crush him with your foot like an ant. It is not certain that the city of Kumia in the legend may refer to the city of Kumani, which was a major religious center of the goddess Hepat. The origins of the meaning of the name Horian, Horite, or Horim may be associated with the meaning of the Iranian word Hara, mountain. This word may survive in the German word for hill, hoch, and the word for higher, huh, possibly in the English word higher itself. This suggests that the Hurrians might simply be designated by the word mountains or hills, a description of their original homeland. It is also possible that the term was originally related to the Sanskrit word hari, which means golden yellow. This word is generally associated with Indra, lord of the mountains, used to describe his bow, his horse, his sandals, and other symbolic possessions. It may even refer to the possession of gold, which in Sanskrit is hiron, later becoming oro in Latin. But to go even further, both of these groups of words may derive from an earlier idea of a golden mountain, the realm of eternal light, where the ancestors of the Aryans supposedly reside upon death. This image is most clearly presented in the later image of Ahura in his glowing home on the top of Mount Hara.
Okay, so we're gonna actually just take a quick brain break. I'm gonna play one of my little commercials. It's just a little quick 60 seconds. But I know it's a lot to take in and read along with. I've sped it up, right? So let's just take a quick minute. I know I need these little brain breaks. It's just a quick 60 seconds and we will jump right back into it. She's going to go into another period and describing that period and the gods and goddesses at that time, in relation to the Northern Invaders and the type of ideas and things that they drew from that we now find in present day patriarchy. But again, let's take a little brain break before we get into that, and we will move forward.
Hey, you guys, it's your girl, Dayna Patreace, aka the Black Fairy. And I am just here to remind you, please like, share, comment, subscribe, okay? Click that notification bell so you don't miss out on any new videos or any new lives, okay? I will be coming here with more and more information. So please, you don't want to miss out. And this is just a quick reminder and a quick thank you because it's a free way to support the channel and to support me. I love y'all.
Okay, so we're just going to hop right back into it. And again, if I have anything to say, I will hop in. But I think I don't think I have anything really to add to this next portion about this particular time that she speaks on. But let's continue.
The Ubaid period. Eridu, Urartu, Ararat, and Arata. Along with these historically attested appearances of the Indo-Europeans from the middle of the 3rd millennium onward, there is the speculative suggestion that the Indo-Europeans, or closely related groups such as the predecessors of the Hurrians, may have entered southern Iraq as early as the 4th millennium BC. A group generally known as the people of the Ubaid culture, so called by archaeologists, for the modern name of the site at which they were first noticed, Al-Ubad, entered the Tigris-Euphrates area at this time. It is most often suggested that the Ubaid people came from the highlands of Iran, though some authorities are now beginning to believe that they moved down from the north of Iraq. Though it is uncertain since there was no form of writing at that time, some writers suggest that the Ubaid people brought the Sumerian language with them. This language, neither Semitic nor Indo-European, has long puzzled many language experts. Professor S.N. Kramer, who has done extensive work deciphering Sumerian tablets, suggests that Sumerian is reminiscent to some extent of the Ural-Altaic languages. Some of the areas in which these languages have been noted are just north and west of the Caspian Sea. It has been suggested that Arata, a place name often mentioned in Sumerian texts, may be in that same area, or just slightly south, in the northwestern stretches of Iran, along the Caspian Sea. From whichever direction their entrance was made, the Ubaid people seem to have established their major settlement in the town later known as Eridu, quite close to the junction where the Tigris and Euphrates join with the Persian Gulf. These same people are known to have spread across the Tigris and Euphrates area. Millard tells us that as a result, the Halaf culture broke up, and at Arpatia there was destruction and massacre. The Ubaid people extended as far north as Lake Urmia and Lake Van, close to the Iranian-Russian border, perhaps the area from which they originated as a more nomadic group. This section was later known as Ararat or Urartu, a name which may have been derived from Arata. It is possible that the name Eridu was once meant to remind its people of the name Arata or Urartu. Urartu was known in later periods to have been inhabited by the Hurrian people, and at times is suggested as their original homeland. In about 4000 BC, the Ubaid people built a temple at Eridu. Though shrines to the goddess had been built in many Neolithic and Chalcolithic towns along the Tigris and Euphrates from 7000 BC onward, this temple at Eridu appears to be the first built on a high platform. Could this have been an attempt to simulate a mountain where there was none? Curiously enough, the Sumerian word for mountain is Hur or Kur. Unlike the other communities present in Iraq at the time, At the Ubaidian temple of Eridu, not a single goddess figurine was found. The Maglemosian and Kunda people, who, as mentioned previously, seem to have been the cultural ancestors of the Indo-European peoples, used dugout canoes, even in Mesolithic times. These boats were basically logs with holes burned out for the occupants. In earlier periods, these people were located in northern Europe and Denmark. 2 canoes, one in the Netherlands and one on the coast of Scotland, have both been attributed to the Maglemosian people. Maglemosian steering paddles, fish nets, and fishing traps reveal that these boats were used for fishing activities, apparently a major aspect of Maglemosian life. With rivers and streams that flow across Europe and the Near East, more numerous at a time closer to the melting of the Ice Age glaciers and pluvial rains that were still occurring in 10,000 BC, it may have been some of these ancient sailors, possibly over many generations, who eventually made their way to the warmer climate of Eridu. Evidence of the Maglemosians has also been found in Estonia, suggesting that they may have traveled down the Volga, which pours into the Caspian Sea. Many of them may have wandered into the numerous river inlets along the western edge of the Caspian, into the Caucasus region. One of the major rivers, even today, that joins with the Caspian Sea is the Iraks. Following the mainstream of the Iraks would have led some of them into the Lake Urmia and Lake Van areas, that is, the land of Urartu. Branches of the Tigris in Urartu join up with the mainstream of that river, leading directly to the Persian Gulf, where the Tigris and Euphrates meet. Hawkes tells us that on the Euphrates, the men of the Al-Ubaid culture were probably the first regular navigators of the river. A model found in a late Al-Ubaid grave at Eridu represents the oldest sailing boat known in the world. The deity worshipped at Eridu in historic times was known as the god Enki. In prehistoric periods, the god of this shrine appears to have been a fish or water god. Offerings of fish were burned on his altar. In historic times, Enki was thought of as a god of the waters, often described as riding about in his boat, or simply called he who rides. This concept of the fish or water god is quite like one found in a fragment of an Indo-European Hittite tablet, which tells of a sun god who rose from the water with fish on his head. It is also reminiscent of the sun god, who was born from the cosmic waters supposedly released by Indra upon the deaths of Danu and Vritra. Though Enki is not generally designated as a sun god, in the myth of Marduk, he is named as Marduk's father, whereupon Marduk is called the son of the sun. The Ubaid people are credited with first developing irrigation canals in Eridu. Though these later salted up from the Persian Gulf, we may see the concept of irrigation canals as a natural idea for people who had lived their lives on rivers and streams, later settling in drier areas. Another possible clue to the identity of the people of the Ubaid period of Eridu is the institution of kingship and the mention of the name Alalu as the very first king of Sumer in the king lists of the earliest part of the second millennium. His residence was listed as Eridu. According to these tablets, which appear to refer back to prehistoric periods, it was in the city of Eridu that kingship was first lowered from heaven. The name Alalu also occurs in the Hurrian myth of Kumarbi, which was previously mentioned. The Hurrian myth begins in former years when Alalu was king in heaven, when Alalu was sitting on the throne. Though it is most often suggested that the Hurrian use of the name Alalu was based on the writings of Sumer, which are older, it is possible that this name remained in the memory of those Ubaidians, who later sailed back to the area of Lake Urmia. Their presence there is attested by sites later than that of earliest Eridu. It is perhaps in this way that the name survived in the Hurrian myths of the people who lived in that area.
Okay, so she's about to get it. This I know I have some commentary on. This next part here. She's going into Sumer and Babylon, new people, new gods, and revealing account of the murder of the goddess, right? So I found this part really intriguing. So yeah, let's get into it.
Sumer and Babylon. New people, new gods, and a revealing account of the murder of the goddess. Somewhere between 3400 and 3200 BC, another group of people appear to have entered Sumer. Professor Saggs writes of the manner of construction of a temple in what is known as the Uruk Level 5 period, as indicating the arrival of a mountain race familiar with the techniques of stoneworking. At this same time, the areas of Nippur and Kish began to develop as populated centers. At Nippur of historical periods, a god known as Enlil appears to have taken the limelight from Enki. In myths and inscriptions, we read of Enlil as the bright-eyed great mountain, his temple described as the house of the mountain. Despite the fact that Nippur, in fact most of Sumer, is no higher than about 600 feet above sea level. His introduction into the city of Nippur is associated mythologically with the rape of the daughter of the goddess in Nippur, Nanbarshakanu. The daughter's name is then given as Ninlil, and later she is described as Enlil's wife. Enlil was also known as Lord Air, a title also associated with a deity in Egypt, where the sign for the word air is a sail. In Hurrian myths, Kumarbi is associated with the town of Nippur. They claim that it is Kumarbi's town. In Sumerian tablets, we find the goddess under many names. In earlier times, each of these may have been revered as the divine ancestress of a particular community or town. Ninsikil was the patron deity of Dilmun, the paradise of the Sumerians, but is also listed as an actual place in many records. Namu was known as she who gives birth to heaven and earth, as well as the mother of all deities. Nina was worshipped as the prophetess of deities. Nanshi of Lagash was she who knows the orphan, knows the widow, seeks justice for the poor, and shelter for the weak. On New Year's Day, she judged all of humankind. Nidaba of Erech was known as the learned one of the holy chambers, she who teaches the decrees, the great scribe of heaven. Shala, a title of Inanni, described herself as mighty queen goddess who designs heaven and earth, am I. Ningal, or Nikal, great lady, who in historical times was known as the wife of a moon god named Nannar, Sin in Akkadian, may at one time have been worshipped as the sun. In Anatolia, several high priestess queens of the sun goddess of Arena had the name Nikal as part of their names. In historical periods, she was said to be the mother of Utu, the sun, which may have been a later innovation. A shrine in Ur, which in the earliest periods may have been just that of Ningal, was in most periods shared with her husband. In the Kassite period of Ur, she was totally removed from the main shrine and placed in a smaller annex. There is a long poem to her as the mother and queen of Ur, with Nannar mentioned as her Ishib priest. The goddess Ninhursag, also known as Ninmah, seems to be closely identified with the worship of Enki, as his wife and sister, though in earliest legends, she plays a rather dominating role, and her name often precedes those of Enki and Enlil. One legend explained that with the help of Namu, she created the first people. The goddess known as Ur-Eshkagal, whom we later hear of as the mistress of the underworld, in one early Sumerian legend, is carried off to the underworld as a prize, at the time that Enlil took possession of the earth. But as we just read, even in the underworld, she was given no peace, eventually being forced to accept a consort to rule beside her, to whom she was made to present the tablets of destiny. The name of the goddess as Inanna appears to have been derived from Inin, Inini, or Nina. She may have become the daughter of Ningal at the same time that Utu became the sun. By the time we meet her in the period of written legend, shortly after 2000 BC, though she still receives great reverence, she has clearly lost what was previously hers. Though Namu had created heaven and earth, and Ninhursag, Nintu, or Ninmah, the first people, one myth tells us that Enki established world order. In this myth, we read that he created the irrigation canals, making the Tigris and Euphrates eat together. We next learn that he had appointed various deities to certain positions, and that Enki himself, or the personage appointed in charge of the canals, has carried off like fat the princely knee from the palace. Though this line is rather obscure, it may refer to the murder of a young prince at that time. Shortly afterward, we twice read that Inanna has given up her royal scepter, upon which she twice asks Enki, "Where are my royal powers?" As if to console her, he tells her that she is still in charge of the words spoken by the young lad, words which she had established, and that the crook, the staff, and the wand of shepherdship were still hers. As if in further explanation of her loss of powers as a result of the canal building, he ends with, "Inanna, you who do not know the distant wells, the fastening ropes, the inundation has come, the land is restored, the inundation of Enlil has come." In this legend, we may be reading an explanation of the diminished powers and status of the goddess upon the arrival of the Ubadians of Eridu, or by the advocates of Enlil at Nippur, to whom, according to Sumerian legend, Enki presented many gifts. Since the myth was not written until after 2000 BC, it would be difficult to say whether these changes occurred during the arrival of the Enki people, or at the time of the settling of Nippur. Though the position of women and the supremacy of the goddess certainly lost ground all through the historical period of Sumer, these changes may have been happening for centuries, even millennia. Yet throughout the historical period, the goddess, as Inanna, was still deeply revered, especially in Erech. She appears to have been regarded continually as the one who bestowed the rights of shepherdship or kingship, suggesting that the matrilineal rights to the royal throne continued to exist, a factor that will be more thoroughly discussed in Chapter 6. There may even have been a revival of the religion of the goddess between the two periods, since one myth is concerned with the transfer of the cultural center from Eridu to Erech, Enki claiming that Inanna had stolen all the gifts of civilization from him. Alongside the archaeological evidence that many of these gifts of civilization had been developed in the goddess-worshipping communities of Neolithic times, it is also interesting to note that the words the Sumerians used for farmer, plow, furrow, smith, weaver, leather worker, basket maker, potter, and mason were not Sumerian words, but apparently borrowed from another, perhaps earlier language. A third male deity was introduced to Sumer, probably shortly before the beginning of the second millennium, a period when Hurrians are known to have been entering the area. He is known as An or Anu, generally defined as the Sumerian word for sky. Yet the word An or Ahan appears in several Indo-European languages as ancestor, while in German, Il An is defined as primeval ancestor. This title occurs in the Indo-European Greek name Uranus, a sky god. Professor Hook tells us that in the early Sumerian period, the name Anu is relatively obscure, and his name does not appear on any of the 18 lists belonging to this period. Anu appears as the successor to Alalu in the Hurrian and Hittite Kumarbi myth previously discussed. But most interesting is his appearance in the later myth of Marduk, the son of the sun. Here we learn that Enki was first asked to subdue the creatress goddess, whom they call Tiamat, and was not able, though he did manage to kill her husband, Apsu, thus becoming lord of the Apsu, primeval waters, himself. Then Anu was asked, but according to the legend, when he confronted her, he cringed in fear and refused to complete his mission. Finally, Marduk, son of Enki, was willing, though only upon the promise of the supreme position among all of the deities if he succeeded. This previously secured promise brings to mind the one Indra requested before murdering Danu and her son Vritra. Both of these myths were probably written about the same period, 1600 to 1400 BC. This legend, known as the Enuma Elish, which explains the supremacy of Marduk, has long been designated as Babylonian, and therefore Akkadian and Semitic. But latest research suggests that though Marduk was known in the Hammurabi period, the myth claiming his supremacy did not actually appear until after the Kassites had conquered Babylon. Professor Saggs points out that none of the extant texts belonging to it is earlier than the first millennium, and that it has been suggested that in fact this work arose only in the Kassite period, a time now known to have been one of intense literary activity. As I mentioned before, the Kassites were also ruled by the Indo-Europeans. Gurney tells us that the names of Indian deities are found to form an element in the names of the Kassite rulers of Babylonia, though once again, the greater part of the Kassite people were not Indo-European. In about 2100 BC, a Sumerian king named Ur-Nammu declared that he would establish justice in the land, somewhat like the reforms of Uruk-agina, who preceded him. It was said that he did away with the heavy duties and taxes that were burdening the people at that time, and rid the land of the big sailors who seized oxen, sheep, and donkeys. In many of the legends and inscriptions of Sumer, the people of Sumer are often referred to as the black-headed people. This designation, which was probably a description of the hair coloring of most of the inhabitants of Sumer at that time, is interesting when one begins to question why the phrase first came into use. Usually, people are identified by whatever is different about them. We would not refer to a group as the two-eyed people, unless there was also a group of people with only one eye, or with more than two eyes. This description, so often applied to the people of Sumer and the writings of Sumer itself, may well be another indication that those who first coined the term and used it were themselves, or were at least familiar with, others who were not black-headed people, but people with hair of a lighter color. Each of these connections, when viewed side by side, may suggest that Enki, Enlil, Anu, and Marduk were each introduced by Indo-European or closely related northern groups entering the goddess cultures of Mesopotamia. Enlil, Enki, and Anu appear to have become gradually assimilated into the vaster numbers of goddess-worshipping people. But the later figure of Marduk, and especially Ashur, who succeeded to his position in Hurrian-controlled Assyria, were worshipped in societies where the position of women had certainly lost ground.
What I'm noticing with her going through all these, places that were conquered by the Northern Invaders. Hold on a moment. I wanted the sirens to pass. But what I was saying was all these places had to create all these stories and myths to prop up these male deities. And they all do it within the same way, right? Again, this is something that happened over time. And she's going through pretty much city or state or country, depending on how you look at it and how they did it and which gods were replaced with which and which ideals were put in place and how they made this dwindle. It's very interesting, but they pretty much went place to place doing the same damn thing, right? But we're going to continue. She's going to go into Egypt next. Yeah, let's continue.
Egypt, a boat in the heavens. The other possible, though also speculative, appearance of these same northern invaders may have occurred shortly before the earliest dynastic period of Egypt. Just before 3000 BC, there is evidence of an invasion in Egypt, shortly after which, just as in Eridu, kingship was first instituted. Upper and Lower Egypt were then joined together for the first time under that one king. Until the time of the invasion, the Neolithic cultures of Egypt appear to have held the cobra goddess of the north, Uazit, and the vulture goddess of the south, Nekbet, as the two supreme deities, though there were many other local deities worshipped in each community. After the invasion, the two goddesses were demoted, though they continued to symbolize the royal crowns of Upper and Lower Egypt, both of which were now worn on the king's head, one inside the other. Emmy L. Malowin writes that the inference that there was some contact between Egypt and Sumer at the time is confirmed by the presence of Jemdet Nasser-type seals. The Jemdet Nasser period of Sumer was the time of the settling of Nippur and apparently the introduction of Enlil. Malawan, judging from methods of construction and style, also suggested that the First Dynasty tombs may have been inspired by the temples of Mesopotamia. Discussing the Jemdet Nasser period, Sags reports that abundant evidence of Mesopotamian cultural influence is found at this time in Egypt. Significant is the fact that cylinder seals, a specifically Mesopotamian invention, occur there, together with methods of building in brick foreign to Egypt, but typical of the Jemdet Nasser culture. In Egypt, also at this time, Mesopotamian motifs and objects are represented in art, a striking example being a boat of Mesopotamian type found carved on a knife handle. Whilst the principle of writing, though not the technique, was certainly taken over by the Egyptians from Mesopotamia. It may be that the same people who were known as the Ubaid in Sumer, perhaps leaving during the Jemdet Nasser period when the newer groups were entering Sumer, made their way into Egypt at that time. Paintings in early dynastic tombs portray a conical basket type of fish trap, nearly identical to those of the Ertabala people of northern Europe, who were descended directly from the Maglemosians. In Egypt, the god who was assigned the role of father to the ancient goddess Nut was known as Shu, Lord Air. As I mentioned before, in Egypt the sign for air is a sail, while the sign for the word gods is a series of banners or pendants, which are otherwise seen at the prow of boats. The male deity of Egypt, who arrived with the invaders, was portrayed as a sun god riding in his boat, much as Enki was known as he who rides. Professor Walter Emery spent some 45 years excavating the ancient tombs and pyramids of Egypt. Discussing the arrival of these people, he writes, "Whether this incursion took the form of gradual infiltration or horde invasion is uncertain, but the balance of evidence, principally supplied by the carving on an ivory knife handle from Jebel el Araq and by paintings on the walls of a late pre-dynastic tomb at Hierakonpolis, strongly suggests the latter. On the knife handle we see a style of art which some think may be Mesopotamian, or even Syrian in origin, and a scene which may represent a battle at sea against invaders, a theme which is also crudely depicted in the Hierakonpolis tomb. In both representations, we have typical native ships of Egypt and strange vessels with high prow and stem of unmistakable Mesopotamian origin. At any rate, towards the close of the 4th millennium BC, we find the people known traditionally as the followers of Horus apparently forming an aristocracy or a master race ruling over the whole of Egypt. The theory of the existence of this master race is supported by the discovery that graves of the late pre-dynastic period in the northern part of Upper Egypt were found to contain the anatomical remains of a people whose skulls are of greater size and whose bodies were larger than those of the natives, the difference being so marked that any suggestion that these people derived from the earlier stock is impossible. He also describes a scene on a mace head of one of the earliest kings, which portrays him building a canal, apparently amid great ceremonial activity, and adds that there is strong evidence to show that the conqueror of the north attempted to legitimize his position by taking the northern princess as his consort. The invaders of this period were known to the Egyptians as the Shemsu Hor, people of Hor. The Hor tribes eventually made Memphis their capital. Upon their arrival, the new male deity was introduced. He was called Hor, Great Hor. Writing of the origins of the Hor figure in Egyptian mythology, Rudolf Anthes, professor of Egyptology, explains, "The time was the beginning and middle of the 3rd millennium BC, starting with the earliest documentation of history, and the circumstances were prompted by the establishment of the kingship in Egypt. By 2900 BC, pictures of the sun god Horwer show him riding about in his boat of heaven. We may find this conceptual imagery of the sun god riding in his boat in the heavens, not unlike the later Indo-European imagery of India and Greece, where the sun god then rode across the heavens in a horse-drawn chariot." According to Professor Emery, the name of the first king of the first dynasty, known as Narmer or Menes in Manetho's history of 270 BC, was actually Hor-Aha. But the name of Hor appears to then have been incorporated into the more ancient religion of the goddess as the sun who dies. This has led to much confusion between the two Hors. One, the elder god of light of the invaders. The other, the son of the goddess Isis. Hor, later known as Horus to the Greeks, was described in various texts as fighting a ritual combat with another male deity known as Set. Set is generally identified as the uncle or brother of Hor. The fight symbolized the conquest of Hor over Set, Hor symbolizing light and good, Set standing for darkness and evil. Dr. E. Wallace Budge wrote that the fight which Horus the sun god waged against night and darkness was also at a very early period identified with the combat between Horus, the son of Isis, and his brother Set. Originally, Set or Sut represented the natural night and was the opposite of Horus. In Sanskrit, the word Sat means to destroy by hewing into pieces. In the myth of Osiris, who is Horus after his death, though also known as the father of Horus at the same time, it was Set who killed Osiris and cut his body into 14 pieces. But it may be significant that the word Set is also defined as queen or princess in Egyptian. Set, known as Isis by the Greeks, is defined as exceeding queen. In the myth of the combat, Set tries to mate sexually with Horus. This is usually interpreted as being an insult. But the most primitive identity of the figure Set, who is also closely related to the serpent of darkness known as Zet, and often referred to by classical Greek writers as Typhon, the serpent of the goddess Gaia, may once have been female or in some way symbolic of the goddess religion, perhaps related to Uazit, Great Serpent, the cobra goddess of Neolithic times. The followers of Hor who invaded Neolithic Egypt established the institution of kingship. Hor was often symbolized as a hawk or falcon, the Horus name of the king always being designated by a hawk. In Indo-European Iran, the word Exvarna meant the legitimate royal authority. In one Iranian myth, this Exvarna left its owner and flew away from him in the form of a hawk. The Shamsu Hor occur in the remote periods of pre-dynastic Egypt. Information on them is sparse, but may the Shamsu Hor at one time have been related to the people we later know as the Horians or Horites, first having made their home in northern Iran, later in Sumer, eventually to become the Shamsu Hor of Egypt. Around the time of the Second Dynasty, the town of Heliopolis, known to the Egyptians as Anu, some 10 miles north of Memphis, became the home of a school of scribal priests who also worshipped a sun god who rode in a boat. In this town, they used the name Ra. In Sanskrit, Ra means royal or exalted on high. This prefix is found in the Sanskrit word for king, Raja, and queen, Rani. It survives in the German word ragen, to reach up, in French as roi, meaning king, as well as in the English words royal, reign, and regal. In the pyramid texts of the 5th dynasty, about 2400 BC, Horus was equated with Ra. Both Horus and Ra were closely connected, at times competitively, with the right to kingship. As Ra Horakti, Ra is identical with Horus of the horizon, both meaning the sun at rising. Ra too is portrayed as the sun who rides across the heavens, sitting in his sacred boat. Why a boat in the heavens? Was it because the men who brought the idea of a god of light actually did arrive in their boats? Ra's boat was said to emerge out of the primeval waters, much as Enki was said to ride his boat in the deep waters of the Abzu of Eridu, or as the Indo-Aryan sun god was said to have emerged from the cosmic waters. As in the Indo-European Hittite myth of the sun god in the water, who rises from the sea with fish on his head, so too Ra rose from the waters each morning. As sun god, Ra was known as the Shining One, the forefather of light, the Lord of light. And once again we find the dragon myth, so suggestive of the Aryan religion. Daily, Ra fought the serpent of darkness known as Zet, later called Apophis. Why it should have been seen as such a difficult task for the sun to rise, especially in the climate of Egypt, is puzzling. One might better understand this type of thought originating in northern Europe, but the darkness of night was seen as a power that had to be fought daily, just as the Indo-Aryan Varuna had to perform daily sacrifices to bring the sun out of the deep dark space under the earth. As the name of Horus was assimilated into the goddess religion, as the son of Isis, the priests of Memphis proposed another concept of the great father god. This time his name was Ptah, curiously like the Sanskrit Pitar. The text concerning him described the creation of all existence, suggesting that Ptah was there first. This time we are told that it was through an act of masturbation that Ptah caused all the other gods to come into being, thus totally eliminating the need for a divine ancestress.
Now, this was interesting to me because even when I was learning about Black history, and a lot of people referenced Egypt, we were kings in Egypt, and these deities that we used to pray to, and what the Ankh means, and things such as that. It's funny how even in her findings, that wasn't the origin story. It's funny how the men in my community, and I say my community, the Black community throughout the diaspora, who speak on these things will stop right there. They won't go even further back, which would then recognize that Egypt was in fact matriarchal, just as her findings were, right? All these Horus, Ra, there were goddesses and gods that they came from even before then. She's showing a transformation that goes further back than those stories. Like, she's spoken on Egypt and their creationists in different names, right? At any given point, but specifically in how they eradicated the goddess in Egypt is what she's speaking on right now. And these gods came later, right? These gods came with the ideals that we now have for patriarchy, right? Those planted the seeds for the society that we have today. And that's what stuck out to me here, because I remember when I first woke up and I realized, again, that how religion was used as a tool of oppression on my ancestors, and that, deconstructing those religious ideals and where they came from, was diminished through these stories of like ancient Egypt that I learned within the Black history spectrum. But it's funny that they didn't further move back, because a lot of African countries, majority of the continent at one point seemed to have been matriarchal. So I did find it interesting while listening to her, and she has a little bit more to go. At this speed, we have about 25 minutes left of the book itself, but I don't know. It was just interesting to me. If it's interesting to you, let me know. I'm gonna actually do like another just quick little brain break. I know we're powering through, but yeah, let's just take a quick little brain break, another minute break to just collect our thoughts and come back into it. She does have a little ways to go before she goes into the next part of another place that was conquered over, and how we're getting towards the part where I didn't really get to read myself, so that will be interesting. But yeah, we'll be right back.
Hey, y'all. Do you need a gratitude journal? Well, if you do, me, myself, and I, Dayna Patreace, aka the Black Fairy, have gratitude journals available for sale in the link below. They go for $6.99 USD, and no worries. By clicking the link in the bio, it will send you straight to your country and to your currency. So don't worry about that. But just to give you a rough estimate, it is $6.99. Now, if you didn't know, gratitude is one of the best ways to not only affirm what it is that you want in your life, but to affirm what it is you want to see in your life. With that being said, this is a great tool and opportunity for you to take a part of. It's an inexpensive way for you to tap into the law of attraction. I highly, highly recommend it. And I love y'all. Link in the bio below.
Okay, so let's continue.
Yet despite the inroads of male deities who replaced the cobra and vulture goddesses as the supreme deities of Egypt, we find the concept of the goddess far from forgotten. The ancient Egyptians, so adept at incorporating new deities into their religion, at times to the point where the myriad names and interweaving of myths is overwhelming, seem to have assimilated the male deities of the invaders, synthesizing the religion into various new forms. Judging from the retention of matrilineal descent patterns well into historical periods, they probably assimilated the invaders as well, though many may have remained in the royal house. The nature of the cobra goddess, Uizit, was retained in several other later female deities. One is the goddess known as Hathor, literally defined as House of Hor. She is generally symbolized as a cow who wears the cobra upon her forehead. But she is described in one text as the primeval serpent who first created the world. Auset, too, portrayed in human form, wore the cobra upon her forehead. The name Auset appears to have been taken from the name Uizit. Most interesting is the Egyptian goddess known as Ma'at. Ma'at symbolized the order of the universe, all that was righteous and good. Depending upon the location of the text, she came to be known as the Eye of Horus, the Eye of Ra, or the Eye of Ptah. Eye in Egyptian is Uzet, again a word most similar to Uizit, but in Indo-European Greek, the word for eye is Mati. Ma'at was the embodiment of the ancient uraeus cobra. She seems to have been allowed to retain her qualities and nature as long as she was assigned to one of the male deities as his possession. Professor Anthes writes, as long as the king lived, the uraeus was, as the pyramid texts express it, magically guarded by the king. When the king died, however, the venomous viper would escape unless it was taken into custody. This suggests that law and order, as perceived by the followers of Hor, Ra, or Ptah, was possible only as long as the cobra goddess was controlled by the king. The strange combination of qualities assigned to the uraeus cobra, then known as Ma'at, ultimate wisdom and dangerous, perhaps rebellious chaos, suggests that the cobra symbolized to the kings of Egypt the goddess-worshipping society she originally represented. One reference in the pyramid texts of the 5th dynasty has long puzzled students of ancient Egyptian culture. This was the account that in earlier times, men were sacrificed at the grave of Osiris, men with red hair. If the Shemsu Hor were related to the people we later recognize as the Indo-Europeans or Horites, this reference becomes more understandable. The question of whether the people of the Ubaid period of Eridu, those of the Jemdet Nasser period of Nippur, or the Shemsu Hor of Egypt were actually groups of early Indo-Europeans, or closely related peoples from the Caucasus and Iratu areas, must at this time remain as hypothetical speculation, at least until further research is undertaken. What is certain is that these groups brought the worship of the male deity with them as they entered the lands of the people who held the goddess as sacred. And both the Ubaidians and Shemsu Hor appear to have first initiated the concept of kingship, while the Jemdet Nasser people at Nippur and Kish revived it. The Hittites, the creation of an exclusive caste. Returning to the more historically attested periods of the Indo-European invasions, the Hittites are believed to have entered Anatolia from the Caucasus region at about 2200 BC, though there are instances of earlier arrivals of small numbers of these same people. According to Professor Gurney, examination of the skulls which have been found on several sites in Anatolia shows that in the 3rd millennium BC, the population were preponderantly long-headed or dolichocephalic Mediterranean, with only a small admixture of brachycephalic alpine types. In the 2nd millennium, the proportion of brachycephalic skulls increases to about 50%. It was these brachycephalic or alpine people who eventually came to be known as the ruling class of the Hittite Empire. Before their arrival, the inhabitants of the land were known as the people of Hatti. It was actually the name of Hatti that led to the name of these people as Hittites, so called by early scholars who were still unaware that the Hittite kingdom was composed of two quite distinct groups of people. This was further complicated by the fact that several Hittite kings took the name Hattusili, and the invaders named the capital Hattusas, perhaps thus identifying themselves as belonging to the people. Now better understood, it is clear that the original inhabitants of the land became the subservient or conquered class, while the invading Indo-Europeans assumed the roles of royalty and leadership, much as the Shemsu Hor did in Egypt, and the historically attested Aryans did in India, human Mitanni among the Kassites, and later in Greece and Rome. The Hittite state, says Gurney, was the creation of an exclusive caste superimposed upon the indigenous population of the country. A group of Indo-European immigrants became dominant over an aboriginal race of Hattians. Professor Sachs tells us that after the period of confusion resulting from the incursion of Indo-European invaders into the region of the Halys, one of their princes, a certain Liburnius, carved out a kingdom for himself, which, according to Hittite tradition, he rapidly enlarged by military successes until he made the sea his frontiers. Sachs agrees with Gurney, stating that government in the Hittite kingdom was at this time essentially restricted to a noble and closed caste, ruling over the indigenous population and alone concerned in military activities and the central administration of the state. The Indo-Europeans, with their horse-drawn war chariots and iron weapons, as well as their greater physical size, even further emphasized by conical hats that appear to be about 18 to 24 inches high, possessed a military supremacy never before encountered. The wheeled vehicle occurs in the goddess-worshipping cultures of the Halof period, but up until the arrival of the Hittites and Hurrians, wagons and chariots were apparently hitched only to donkeys, primarily as a means of transportation of people and products. It was only upon the advent of the Indo-European Mariano warriors that the horse was used and horse-drawn war chariots were introduced into the Near East. According to Rig Veda descriptions, these chariots were pulled by horses, two abreast, and driven by two riders. It is generally stated that sometime during the 2nd millennium BC, the Hittites discovered the process of mining and smelting iron, though one iron dagger was found in a grave dated about 2500 BC. Compared with the copper, gold, and bronze of the goddess cultures, iron obviously provided more efficient weaponry. The word iron may be related to the word Aryan, for it was closely associated with these people, who managed to keep the process a secret for many centuries after its discovery. The Neolithic Egyptians had used meteoric iron, which they referred to as metal from heaven. It was perhaps this association of iron, though scientifically attested terrestrial iron with the Aryans, that led to the legends that suggested their heavenly origins and the idea that kingship had been lowered from heaven. Between the monopoly on iron weapons and the speed and force, as well probably as the intimidating effects upon peaceful urban people of the horse-drawn war chariots, the Indo-European invaders held a military power unknown in the Near East until their arrival. The conquered Hattians must have been kept tightly in line through fear of this well-armed warrior caste that ruled their country. One Hittite law stated, "If anyone opposes the judgment of the king, his household shall become a ruin. If anyone opposes the judgment of a dignitary, his head shall be cut off." Before the invasions, the Hittites had not yet developed a written language, at least not one that was used for recording myths and literature. Hittite hieroglyphs do appear, which I shall discuss more fully later. Upon their arrival and contact with the Akkadian people, they began to use the Akkadian cuneiform alphabet, which was based on the writing of the Sumerians. Though in the writing of many of their myths, the Hittites actually used the Akkadian language, their own language was also transferred into the Akkadian manner of writing. It is this Hittite language that appears as one of the earliest forms of Indo-European speech. In early historic times, this language is most closely associated with Sanskrit, Latin, and Greek. At the present time, we find it related to German, French, English, Danish, and nearly all other European languages. Gurney reports that the discovery that Hittite had affinities with the Indo-European languages was made by Czech scholar B. Hrosny and published in 1915. The suggestion that an Indo-European language was spoken by the population of Asia Minor in the 2nd millennium before Christ was so startling that it was first received with great skepticism. He goes on to say that it has now been proven without a doubt. The original Hattians, who may have been related to the much earlier goddess-worshipping people of Çatalhöyük, which is about 125 miles south of the Hittite capital of Hattusas, seem also to have held the goddess as their supreme deity. Goddesses such as Hanahana, Hepat, Kupapa, and the great sun goddess of Arena all appear to have survived from the earlier Hattian religion. In several texts, the goddess was simply called the throne, the title associated with Isis in Egypt. Though there is evidence in their texts that the Hittites worshipped Indra, Mitra, and Varuna, Hittite myths and accounts of these deities have not yet been unearthed. Mountain storm gods were introduced by the Hittites, and in the writings of Hittite Anatolia, we are treated to some of the attitudes toward these new male deities. In the inscriptions of King Anita, one of the earliest Hittite kings, the storm god Taru is mentioned as the supreme deity. Yet centuries later, in the city of Arena, said to be a day's journey from Hattusas, but not yet located, there is a different story. Gurney observes from the text of Bogaz Koi that at Arena, the principal deity was apparently the sun goddess, where Usimu. Her consort, the weather god Taru, takes second place, and there are daughters named Mizula and Hula, and even a granddaughter, Zintuhi. Some texts describe the rituals observed by a series of Hittite queens for the sun goddess of Arena, revealing that the queen also held the role of high priestess to the goddess. As I mentioned before, this close relationship of the Hittite queens to the sun goddess suggests that at one time the invading Indo-Europeans may have gained popular acceptance and legitimacy upon the throne by marrying Hattite priestesses who may have held the rights to the throne through the matrilineal descent. Gurney explained that the Aryan kings retained the old Hattite shrines, while at the same time assuming in their own person the office of supreme high priest of the realm. Once more we find the myth of the defeat of the dragon. The Hittite king, Mersilis II, wrote of having to celebrate the festivals of the storm god in several cities. In the same letter, he referred to the major festival of this nature being celebrated at the capital at Hattusas, at the mausoleum of the goddess known as Lilwanis. At these festivals, a ritual combat was either recited or enacted, perhaps much like the one between Hor and Set in Egypt. This combat was between the storm god and the dragon Iluyankis. It seems that Mersilis, as king, may even have played a role in the drama, possibly as the storm god. But the other figure involved in the story, that of a young man named Huppaseus, who upon sleeping with the goddess known as Inara, gained enough strength to help the storm god defeat the dragon, seems a more likely role. The story of Huppaseus gaining strength by making love with a goddess may have been enacted by an annual sacred sexual union, much like those described in the texts of Sumer and Babylon, which will be more thoroughly explained in Chapter 6. In those countries, the king played the role of the son and or lover to the high priestess of the goddess.
So again, I just want to say, like, the reason why you don't hear a lot of commentary from me, and maybe I don't have to keep repeating myself, but I'm pre-recording this, so I can't engage with you guys as I'm going, but is because that she's very thorough in what is she is explaining. I don't really think there's much to say about how these northern invaders conquered each place at a time, the stories behind each deity and how they evolved. I don't think that I have much to contribute that other than that's interesting. You know what I mean? So we're going to continue. We have about 11 minutes left to this chapter, which isn't a very long time. Again, I will have more commentary at the end of this all. So I'm probably just going to let it run for the next 10 minutes. And before I get into like my full final thoughts.
Goddess, who then endowed him with the rights of kingship. If this is so, it again suggests that the early Indo-European kings may have played this role with Hattite priestesses to legitimize their position. The name of the dragon Iluyankis may be related to the goddess Lilwanis. In the end, the dragon was killed, just as the goddess Tiamat, symbolized as a dragon, was killed by Marduk. Is it merely coincidence that the festival took place not in the temple of Lilwanis, but in her mausoleum? The name of the Hittite god Taru is at times related to the Hittite word tar, to conquer. In Sanskrit, the word Tora means mighty, while in India, Tora Shah was another name for Indra. This word may survive in the words Taurus and Tauros, meaning bull. But it may also be connected with mountains, as is the word Hor, Hur, or Hara. Alongside the fact that one of the major mountain ranges in Anatolia is called the Tauros Mountains, and one of its highest peaks known as Mount Tauros, we find that in the Indo-European Celtic language, Tor means rocky hilltop. In German, Turm means tower, and in English we have the word tower itself. This name appears as that of the Etruscan storm god Tarshan, and may even in some way be associated with the well-known Viking storm god Thor. The Hittites were often in conflict with Egyptian armies, both trying to gain control of Canaan, the area today known as parts of Syria, Lebanon, and Israel, Palestine. Possibly as a result of these conflicts, in an effort to make peace, or perhaps to infiltrate. Hittite, Hurrian, and Kassite princesses were sent as wives to Egyptian kings of the 18th dynasty, 1570 to 1300 BC, for several generations in succession. Both Queens Tai and Nefertiti, respectively mother and wife, of the religious revolutionary king Akhenaten, are thought by some authorities to have been of Hittite or Hurrian descent. If this is true, it may account for the religious revolution of about 1350 BC, which made Akhenaten move his capital to El Amarna, rejecting all other deities than Ra as the disk of the sun, which he called Aten. If these marriages were an attempt to infiltrate, the plan worked, for Akhenaten, supposedly so interested in his religious activities, ignored his colonies and allies in Canaan, which in turn allowed the Hittite and Hurrian armies to gain control. Still another curious event was the receipt of a letter by a Hittite king shortly after the deaths of Akhenaten and his son-in-law Tutankhamun. There is some argument as to whether it was sent by Nefertiti or her daughter Anches-en-Amon. In the letter, the writer, identifying herself as the Queen of Egypt, asked the Hittite king to send her one of his sons, so that she might make him her husband. The Hittites, as well as other Indo-European ruled nations, were continually involved in international wars and politics. Under King Marsilis, the Hittites raided Babylon in about 1610 BC, though when Marsilis was assassinated, the Kassites took over the reins of government. The Hurrian state of Mitanni, from about this same time, controlled Assyria for several centuries, while the Kassites conquered the ancient Sumerian cities of Ur and Erech. From the 20th to the 16th centuries BC, the archaeology of Canaan shows continual nomadic disruption. This is generally attributed to local nomadic warfare. But as Professor Albright, who describes the entrance of the Indo-Europeans into Canaan as a migratory movement, tells us, by the 15th century, Indo-Aryan and Horite princes and nobles were established almost everywhere. It is seldom suggested that the nomadic disruption may have been the result of the original invasions of these Indo-Aryan and Horite tribes entering the country and battling until they were finally accepted as rulers. Describing letters found in the archives of Ignaton at El Amarna, Werner Keller writes, though it may sound extraordinary, a third of these princely correspondents from Canaan have Indo-Aryan ancestry. The name Baal, eventually used as the name of the male consort of the goddess in Ugarit, Canaan, in the 14th century BC, and the consort of Ashtoreth in the biblical period of southern Canaan after Moses, about 1250 to 586 BC, may also find its origins in the Indo-European language. By the 14th century, a large percentage of the population of Ugarit was Hurrian. Hittite and Hurrian texts used the same sign for Baal as the Akkadians did. In Sanskrit, Bala means much the same as Tora, that is, bull, and mighty or powerful. It is used especially in conjunction with army troops. This may help to explain the dual role of Baal. As the possibly Indo-European storm god in Ugarit, he is lord of Mount Zaphon, asking the goddess Unaf to have a proper temple built for him. Mount Zaphon is also mentioned in the Hurrian myth of Kumarbi. In classical times, it was known as Mount Cassius and described as the location of the battle between Zeus and the serpent Typhon, who, according to Greek legend, was born in a mountain cave in Cilicia, Anatolia, where Zeus first attacked him. It may be significant that the volcanic mountain north of Lake Van is still known as Mount Zaphon, though the Mount Zaphon of Baal is generally described as the Zaphon near Ugarit, today known as Jebel el Akra. Just as Hor became the name used for the son of the goddess Isis in Egypt, the name Baal appears to have been used to replace the name of Tammuz as the consort of the goddess, though the name Tammuz was still used as late as 620 BC in Jerusalem. Another male deity of Ugarit, known as El, is considered to be the consort of the goddess known as Asherah, and thought to have been a part of the goddess religion from the most ancient times. Yet we may once again suspect the nature of El in Ugarit, for the text there continually refer to him as Thorel, suggesting his ties with the Indo-European storm god as well. Luvians, Luvician, or Luvites. Close by Hittite territory in Anatolia existed yet another group of Indo-Europeans, known as the Luvians or Luwians, depending upon the translation. Some of the Luvians lived directly south of the Hittites, in the area known as Cilicia, close to the Taurus Mountains. This is much the same area as the one in which the goddess-worshipping culture of Çatalhöyük once flourished. The Luvians have long been regarded as part of the Hittite nation, and it is only in the past few decades that their existence as a separate group has been clarified. Very little is known of these people, except that they were the authors of what have long been referred to as the Hittite hieroglyphs, picture words appearing most often on royal monuments and in a few texts. These hieroglyphs have been extremely difficult to decipher, and even today many remain a mystery. Varying dates for the Luvian entry into Anatolia are given. Albright writes that the Luwians occupied most of southern Asia Minor, not later than the early 3rd millennium BC. R.A. Crossland, in the Cambridge Ancient History, suggests a later date, stating, the deduction that Luwians were current in western Anatolia from 2300 BC onwards is not improbable in itself. Professor Lloyd agrees with Crossland, saying, in about 2300 BC, a great wave of Indo-European peoples, speaking a dialect known as Luvian, seems to have swept over Anatolia. Their progress was marked with widespread destruction. Some authorities claim that Luvian is archaic compared to Hittite. The name Luvian comes to us through the Hittite texts, which referred to the land in which these people lived as Luvia and their language as Luvili. Much as the people of Hatti were called Hittites, and the Hurrians at times known as Horites, they may as likely have been called Luwites or Luvites. French archaeologists refer to them as Luvites. The Germans call them Luvischen. Their actual name may be a significant factor, as I shall explain in the following chapter. Experts in linguistics describe Luvili as an Indo-European language closely related to Hittite. It is only as the hieroglyphs of these people are gradually translated that we have come to learn a little about them. Hans Guterbach, professor of Hittitology, wrote in 1961, we have to assume that the Luwians, too, superseded a population that spoke another language, but this substrate still remains unknown and unnamed. The language written with the so-called Hittite hieroglyphs is nothing else but a Luwian dialect. Because of the problems in deciphering the hieroglyphs, the poor state of what has so far been discovered, and the limitations of the material itself, little is yet known of the Luvian religion. We do know that the major deity was the storm god, whose name was much like the Hittite god Taru. In Luvian, he was known as Tarhund, Tarhunta, or Tarhuis. Guterbach tells us that no mythological material has yet been found in the hieroglyphs, and that they are for the most part of votive character. These are what he refers to as the magic type, spells and incantations inserted into ritual texts. This prevalence of totally religious material in their own archaic hieroglyphs, while other means of writing were readily available, suggests that the Luvians, perhaps much like the Brahmins of India, or the priestly scribes of Ra'ad Anu in Egypt, may also have been a priestly caste. Other indications that seem to affirm this possibility include the fact that scribal schools producing myths in Hurrian, Hittite, and Akkadian appear to have been located in the Luvian territory of Kizzuwatna. Guderbach observes that Kizzuwatna, the region in southeastern Anatolia, including the Cilician Plain, was the one Hittite province in which Hurrian scribal schools must have flourished most prominently. He suggests this on the basis of the fact that there are many Luvian loanwords in texts written in the Hittite language, but which deal with Hurrian myths. But it is equally as possible that it was the Luvians themselves who were making these translations. Little else can be stated about the Luvians, until further interpretations of the hieroglyphs are made, or more material is discovered. But their role in religious history may have been extraordinary, as I will explain in the following chapter, which continues our examination of the patriarchal cultures that eventually destroyed the religion of the goddess.
So that was chapter 4, the Northern Invaders. Very interesting. Again, I didn't find that there was much to comment on. She was very thorough. She kind of explained how these Northern people came to be in these matrilineal communities, how they infiltrated it, how they kind of over time pushed their own agendas, mixing their stories into mythological stories for their gods that they wanted to replace the goddess energy. You know, she was very straight to the point. The next chapter is going to be very interesting. It's one of their own race, which I believe is most probably about, that step into making God of, pretty much European descent, white, and how they infiltrated. It's not a very long chapter. From what I can see, chapter 5 is about an hour. So I was wrong, actually. So yeah, chapter 5 is about an hour, but it doesn't even seem that long from what I could see. And then you could see as well, chapter 6 is only 51. Chapter 7 is 20 minutes, 36 minutes. So the chapters do decrease in time, which will make it easier for me to find the time to do this all. But it's getting very interesting. I, for sure, am excited to read what's next. I'm learning a lot. I'm understanding a lot. And I hope that you guys are too. I hope that the noise that my puppy was making earlier wasn't too distracting. Please share your thoughts on this chapter below in the comment section. Share your views. And I'm going to say I will read another chapter. I'll probably in the next 2 weeks and do the recording then. Again, I'll be in my April bag, and as I stated earlier in the video, I do plan on being more consistent with my videos, despite me being in school and really getting back into this content creation, because I do love what I want this channel to be. And I do want it to be, again, a community of women coming together. I don't want to lead anybody, I don't want to be a leader of anybody, but I do want to have like-minded individuals to discuss these things, because again, I feel like that is how we will manifest a better world, a more matriarchal world. It's not going to happen overnight either. But I do believe as we continue to educate ourselves, read more of these books that teach us about our history as women, and why we needed to be oppressed, and why there is such a need for control of us, because once we as women understand that, we can overcome it. We can see the bullshit right from a mile away, and then that way we can stand in our own truth and stand for ourselves and really become, and I want to say more together, because patriarchy definitely tears us apart, keeps us apart, has us competing with each other when we don't need that. What we need is togetherness, love, understanding. And I feel like as we deconstruct patriarchy, we will definitely